Hello, and welcome to Jenna Rereads the Silmarillion, Episode 6, on the Smelly Fish Hill of Tuna. Okay, so we had a rather big episode last week. It was the longest one I'd ever done, and there was a lot of stuff that happened. We finally got to meet the Elves. They finally woke up, and the Valar finally got off their asses and did something about Melkor. So Melkor was defeated by the Valar, captured, and he is now imprisoned in the halls of Mondos for 3 ages. So he's out of the picture at the moment. But the Valar were still worried about the safety of the elves in Middle-earth, because there's still a bunch of Melkor's monsters and servants and stuff that are, like, running around that they didn't manage to apprehend or kill. So they decide to invite the elves to come live with them in Valinor, and a lot of the elves decide to take them up on their offer. So Orome has been leading this big host of elves all the way across Middle-earth, and they've gotten to Beleriand, which, as we talked about last time, is the sort of westernmost kind of subcontinent of Middle-earth. And while they were there, Elway, or Thingol, who is one of the kings of the Teleri, happened to meet the Maya Melian singing and dancing in the forest, and fell instantly in love, and he's been sort of kept there by her in this sort of trance-like state for, like, years. So the Teleri, who were already, like, dilly-dallying and lagging behind and slowing everybody else down, are now wandering around trying to find him. So that was where we left things last week. Now this chapter, of Eldamar and the Princes of the Eldalie, is one of those kind of name/info dump chapters. So this is, I pretty sure I mentioned back in the Valaquenta that there were going to be 3 of these. The Valaquenta is the first one. This is not, well, I don't know. Maybe it is about as bad as the Valaquenta, but this is another one of those. It's basically, we're going to get the elves to Valinor, and then we're going to talk about, like, where they all end up living, and a bit about the House of Finwe, aka the royal family of the Noldor, which a lot of that information is actually going to be pretty important. So once again, this is not a, like, just skip over it chapter. So alright, let's get going. Okay, so the Vanyar and the Noldor are in Beleriand, and they're ready to cross over to Valinor. Unfortunately, the only land route goes across this frozen ice bridge called the Helcaraxe, which I've mentioned a couple times before. You may remember it's sort of like their equivalent of the Arctic. Not a pleasant place to cross at all. So Orome's not going to take them that way. So he sort of, like, gets Ulmo to come over. And Ulmo's hanging out with them. He, like, they're sort of afraid of the sea at first, because they've not seen the sea before, so they're like, oh, what's this? So Ulmo, like, plays music for them on his horns, which I'm sure you all remember have the totally awesome name of the Ulumuri. And then they like this. His music makes them like the sea, and that's, afterwards elves are susceptible to that sea longing. Remember from Lord of the Rings, Legolas came down with a bad case of sea longing. Yeah, this is where it comes from. So then Ulmo's idea for how he's going to get all the Vanyar and the Noldor to Valinor is to take an island, like a random island that was just in the middle of the ocean, and bring it over and have everybody get on the island and use the island as a sort of transport system. So yeah, that's what they do. They all get on the island, and Ulmo and Ase and Uinen pull it over to Valinor. And then they all get off, and then that's it. The Vanyar and the Noldor are in Valinor. But there's the problem of the Teleri, because the Teleri are still wandering around, getting distracted by everything, and there's also a group of Teleri who are busy trying to find Elway. He's their king, so they're like, what happened to our king? It seems like we haven't seen him in, like, years? maybe we should try to find him, make sure he's okay. So they're trying to find him. So they completely miss Ulmo's summons. They don't even show up. So they're still over there. They're like, they want to go to Valinor too. So what they decide to do, because they can't find Elway, is they're going to make Elway their Soul King. Remember, Elway was Elway's brother. So eventually, Ase and Uinen show up and befriend them. And they learn about, like, the music of the sea and stuff. And it's at this point when the Teleri, like, develop this deep love for the sea, which is why they're called the Sea Elves, because they become BFFs with Ase, which is kind of interesting, because you remember, Ase is the super destructive Maya of Ulmo, who likes causing shipwrecks and stuff, the one who almost went over to Melkor, but then Uinen was like, honey, I don't want you talking to that Melkor anymore. So he didn't. Yeah, that Ase. So, meanwhile, the Noldor are settled in Valinor, and Finway's like, oh, I really miss Elway, and I really miss the Teleri. I wish the Teleri had been able to come with us. And then Ulmo's like, oh, yeah, that's right. That's a shame. So then he decides to go get them. So many of the Teleri are totally ready to go, but Ase kind of doesn't want them to leave, because he said he's become friends with them. And he doesn't want, like, he kind of hangs around the shores of Middle-earth more, and he wants the Teleri to stay there, because he likes hearing them sing and stuff by the sea. So he's not very happy. So he ends up convincing a group of them to stay behind. These become the Elves of the Falas, and they stay in the part of Beleriand called the Bay of Balar, and Círdan the Shipwright is their lord. Remember him from Lord of the Rings? Yep, he's been around this long. So, anyway, there's also that group that was, like, looking for Elway, and a lot of his close kin and friends decide to stay behind, because they haven't found him yet, so they don't want to just leave. But the rest of the Teleri decide to go with Ulmo. So, Elway leads them. Meanwhile, Elway finally wakes up from his weird, creepy trance thing with Melian, and eventually meets up with the rest of his people. And he comes out and is like, hey, guys, there's been a change of plans. I've met this pretty awesome, good-looking Maya, so I think I'm going to stay right here. But, I think I'm quite comfortable where I am. So he and Melian set up a kingdom that'll be called Doriath, which is going to be really important. And so a lot of the Teleri, like I said, like his friends and kinfolk who are looking for him, decide to stay with him. These are going to be called the Sindar. I think I mentioned them last week as a subgroup of Teleri, but yeah, they're the Sindar. And they're going to be important. So they are staying with him in Middle-earth. But, this big group of Teleri is going over to Valinor under Elway. So, they get to travel on the island, like the Noldor and Vanyar did. But Ase still doesn't want the freaking Teleri to go and, like, live further inland in Valinor. So he gets Ulmo to, like, stop the island, where it's still, like, a little ways offshore. Or actually quite a ways offshore. After that, the island the island becomes known as Tol Eressëa. So the Teleri live there for a while. Meanwhile, we'll find out what the Vanyar and Noldor have been doing in Valinor. They are given a area to live in, with a hill that has, oh my god, quite possibly one of the funniest names that you will ever see in Tolkien, and the source of the inspiration for this episode's title. The Vanyar and the Noldor live on the green hill of Tuna. I'm not kidding. That's what it's called. Tuna. Yup. And they build a city called Tirion, which, if you're a Song of Ice and Fire fan, is freaking hilarious. So it's like every time I read Tirion upon Tuna, I can't help but picture Tyrion Lannister sitting on a large fish. But anyway, so they build this city, and it's super beautiful. And they're living together there for a while. But eventually, the Vanyar, like the kiss-asses they are, because you remember that the Manwë and Varda loved them best, and they made their king Ingwe the High King of all the Elves. They decide to sort of move and live closer to the Valar. So they live, like, right around the foot of Taniquetil, the Holy Mountain, and they live in Valmar, which is, like, the city of the Valar. But the Noldor are still living in Tirion, and as you can imagine, Elway really likes the Noldor, because remember, the Noldor are really into making stuff. They're also really into, like, lore and knowledge and things like that. Okay. Now, at this part, we're going to go into the House of Finwe. Now, the House of Finwe is going to be really, 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 really important. Some members of it more than others, but these guys are going to be sort of like the central protagonists of the rest of this book. So it's important to pay attention to who they are. Okay. Alright, here we go. We're going to go through the whole family tree. Alright. Finwe, as we've established, is the High King of the Noldor. Now, he has 2 marriages. This is really unusual among the elves. He's the only elf that ever does so. Now, they're going to go into much more detail on this next time. So I'm not going to talk about it that much this time. I'm going to save it for next week. So, his first wife, Miriel, they have a son named Feanor. I said Feanor is going to be a really, really, really important character. You might remember him from Lord of the Rings, because he got mentioned a few times. Yeah, he's kind of a big deal. And then Finwë's second wife is Indis, who is a Vanya, and they have 2 sons, Fingolfin and Finarfin. I said both of them are important too. So you want to remember the 3 sons of Finwe and the fact that they come from 2 different marriages. That's actually quite important. So now we've got the House of Feanor. Feanor has 7 sons. Now, it's good to know all their names. I'm going to go through all of them, and then I'll tell you which ones are kind of the most important, the ones who you want to make sure you remember. We have Maedhros, the oldest son. Side note, Maedhros is my absolute favorite character in this book, and actually probably in all of Tolkien. I love him so much, but keep the fangirling down for now. There'll be plenty of time to fangirl about him later. Okay, so we have Maedhros, then we have Maglor, the second son. Maglor is known for being a really, really skilled musician, when it's usually the Teleri who are the best at music, probably because of their little music lessons they got from Othe. Then we have Celegorm. Celegorm's thing is hunting and sort of forestry and stuff. He can talk to animals. We have Caranthir. Caranthir is known for being cranky and having a bad temper. Curufin, who is the most like Feanor. I said, of course, I haven't talked about what Feanor is like yet. I'm going to save a lot of the Feanor discussion for next time. And then there's the 2 youngest, who are the twins, Amrod and Amras. Now, of the 7 sons of Feanor, the most important ones are Maedhros, Maglor, Celegorm, and Curufin. Caranthir and the twins we don't really hear about as much. They don't do quite as much. So they're not quite as important. Okay, so moving on, we've got the sons and daughter of Fingolfin. First, we've got Fingon. And Fingon's pretty cool. He does some pretty awesome stuff later in this book. Turgon, Lord of Gondolin. The name Gondolin should be ringing a bell, because that got mentioned a lot in Lord of the Rings. And then they have a sister called Arethel, and she's known as the White Lady of the Noldor. She's a bit of a tomboy in that she likes to do things like hunt and ride and stuff. She hangs out with Celegorm a lot, actually. They both are into hunting. And she's called the White Lady of the Noldor because she wears like all white and silver all the time. And now we've got the sons and daughter of Finarfin. We've got Finrod, who is really cool. Finrod is like the nicest character in this whole book, or one of the nicest, really. He's just so nice, and he wants to be everybody's friend. And Finrod is really sweet. But I said we'll have plenty of time to discuss him more later. Orodreth, Angrod, and Aignor. They don't get, they're not really quite as important. And then there's their sister, Galadriel. Yep, this is Galadriel's family. She is a granddaughter of Finwe, the High King of the Noldor. And through his third son, Finarfin. And interestingly, her mother Eärwen, is the daughter of Elway, the king of the Teleri. So she's got some Teleri blood in there too. So we're going to see Galadriel's backstory, which is very interesting and really adds a lot more depth to what we see of her in The Lord of the Rings, when you understand where she's come from and everything. But she doesn't actually do a whole lot in this book, although she is going to show up in, more than one occasion. Okay, that's the House of Finwe. So, I said, you want to remember Finwe, his 2 wives, his 3 sons, and then of the grandkids, you've got Maedhros, Maglor, Celegorm, Curufin, Fingon, Turgon, Arethel, Finrod, and Galadriel as kind of the most important ones that you want to remember. You can find some handy family trees. I mean, there's one in the back of the book, but you can find some good ones online, too, to keep track of everybody. Okay, so that's the House of Finwe. Now, we got to go back to the Teleri here. Now, the Teleri are having fun living on Tol Eressëa, but then they also decide, they're like, oh, well, this is nice, but we'd like to see Valinor, too. So the Valar totally approve of this, and Ulmo sends Ase to them to teach them how to build ships. So they learn how to build some ships, and then he sends, what I have to assume are, very large swans to pull the ships? Okay, that's a little strange. But, yeah, they, apparently harness some swans and get them to pull their ships. But it works. The swans successfully pull the ships to the shores of Valinor, and they end up building a settlement there called Alcalande, which is the haven of the swans. And there they build these really beautiful swan ships. Now, that may seem like a completely extraneous detail, but it's not. Those swan ships will come into play later on in this book. And they become good friends with the Noldor, because the Vanyar have packed up and they're going to kiss ass with the Valar. So the Noldor and the Teleri are still living, fairly close to each other, although not in the exact same place, and they're good friends. And the Noldor, they've been doing mining and stuff, and, like, because they're friends with Elway, and they end up finding a bunch of, like, jewels and things, but they're not hoarding them or keeping them to themselves. They just start, like, sharing them with everybody freely. So they give, like, a bunch of them to the Teleri, and, like, the Teleri give them a bunch of pearls, because they get a bunch of pearls from the sea, and everything is super pretty, and happy, and wonderful, and for right now, life in Valinor is just absolutely great for the elves. They're like, this is awesome! Making this journey was the best choice, or best decision we ever made! So everything is, like, super happy, and anyway, okay, there's just one more detail in here, which is sort of random, but I'm going to include it because I find it kind of interesting. It mentions here at the very end of the chapter that Feanor and his 7 sons liked to travel around quite a bit, and abode seldom in one place for long, but travelled far and wide upon the confines of Valinor, going even to the borders of the dark and the cold shores of the outer sea, seeking the unknown. Often they were guests in the halls of Elway, but Celegorm went rather to the house of Orome. Yeah, see, Celegorm was kind of like, you know, he hung out with Orome a lot, and from Orome he learned how to talk to animals and hunt and stuff. So I just find that interesting, and I have fun imagining what these Feanorian family vacations are like, which will sound relatively meaningless now, because I said we haven't really talked about Feanor, because he's, you know, the next chapter is all about him, so I'm saving the Feanor discussion for next week. Although, honestly, you could easily, I could fill, like, several of these episodes just talking about Feanor. There's quite a lot to say about him. Okay, but I'm going to save that. So, anyway, that's the end of this chapter. Not a very exciting chapter after, you know, last week's action-packed chapters. But, you know, kind of necessary. And there's not really more discussion to have about this one. I told you which members of the House of Finwe are sort of the most important, the ones you want to remember. So, anyway, we'll just leave the elves where they are right now, living happily in Valinor, where nothing could possibly go wrong, and nothing bad could ever happen. Right? So, next week, it's time to officially meet Feanor. Are you ready for him? Because he's ready for you. All right. See you next time. Take care.